The wind on the Yorkshire moors didn't howl. It screamed. It was a living, spiteful thing that tore at the stone walls of Pendlewood Hall and clawed ice through every crack. Arthur Pendleton, the Viscount, with a title as hollow and cold as his manner, felt it in his bones. It was the winter of 1814. They said the worst in living memory, and Arthur believed it. He believed anything that spoke of ruin. It was a language he'd become fluent in. He was staring into the feeble fire, a glass of something cheap and bitter in his hand, when the sound cut through the storm's rage. Not the wind. A sharp, terrible crack, like the very bones of the earth snapping, followed by a distant, splintering crash. It came from the old road that skirted his land, the road to Blackwood's estate. His first thought was a dark, bitter curl of satisfaction. Let some fool get swallowed by the drift. Let the snow have them. He took a slow drink, the liquor doing nothing to warm the cold knot in his chest. But then, a shape. A flicker of movement through the blizzard-whipped window. Something dark against the relentless white. A horse, wild-eyed and riderless, galloping past the gates. Cursing, Arthur slammed the glass down. It wasn't chivalry that moved him. It was a sharper, more possessive instinct. If something had happened on the border of his land, his ruined land, he needed to know. He needed to see it. He shrugged into his greatcoat, the wool threadbare, and plunged into the wall of white. The cold was a physical assault. It stole his breath and needled his skin like 1,000 knives. He fought his way along the stone fence, the wind trying to pluck him from the earth. And then he saw it. A black lacquered carriage, its crest obscured by frost, lay on its side like a dead beetle in a ditch. One wheel was shattered. The driver was gone, probably fled or frozen. He was about to turn back, his morbid curiosity satisfied, when a drift by the wreck shifted. A patch of white wasn't snow. It was silk, wetting silk, God in heaven. He stumbled forward, his hands numb as he brushed the snow away. It was a woman. Her face was pale as marble, her dark lashes frosted, lips tinged blue. She was dressed for a summer ball, not the end of the world, a gown of ivory satin, now torn and soaked, a ridiculous, delicate thing against the killing cold. An expensive fur-lined cloak was tangled around her, useless. She wasn't moving. Arthur knelt, or the ice seeping through his knees. He fumbled for a pulse at her throat, his own fingers clumsy blocks of wood. There, a faint, thready flutter. A bird trapped in ice. She was alive. Barely. He recognized the carriage's livery now, the subtle pattern in the frost. Blackwood. This was Blackwood's new bride, the one the whole county was whispering about. The final, glittering prize his enemy had claimed, while Arthur rotted in this mausoleum. The logic was perfect, crystalline in its cruelty. Leave her. Let the snow finish what the crash had started. A poetic justice. A blow to Blackwood he could never have planned. He looked at her face again, so young. A strand of dark hair was frozen to her cheek. Her hand, curled slightly, wore a simple gold band. It gleamed dully in the gray light. "Damn it all," Arthur whispered. The words ripped away by the wind. He didn't make a decision. His body made it for him. He shrugged out of his own heavy coat, wrapped it around her fragile, frozen form, and lifted her. She was a slight weight, a bundle of ice and silk. He turned his back on the wreckage and began the brutal trek home. The woman who embodied all his ruin, a cold weight against his chest, her breath a shallow ghost on his neck. The storm, at least, was on his side. It would erase his tracks. It would hide his choice. For now. The great hall of Pendlewood was a tomb of shadows, but Arthur carried his living burden straight to the library. It was the only room he bothered to keep habitable, the fireplace there larger, the draughts slightly less murderous. He laid her on the worn chaise longue before the hearth, the fine silk of her gown a grotesque parody of luxury against the faded velvet. For a long moment he just stood there, dripping melted snow onto the Turkish rug, his own teeth chattering. What did one do with a half-frozen Viscountess, his enemy's wife? He stoked the fire into a roaring blaze, the logs crackling with a violence that matched the storm outside. Heat began to pulse into the room, a tangible force pushing back the edge of the cold. He worked with a rough, practical efficiency born of solitude. He fetched blankets, heavy, woolen things, none of them fine. He tried to rub life back into her hands, her feet, his own hands rough and chapped against her startlingly soft, cold skin. She was so pale. He found a bottle of brandy, the last of the decent stock, and forced a few drops between her blue-tinged lips. She choked, a weak, terrible sound, but swallowed. Then the fever came. It rose with a sudden, frightening speed. One moment she was ice, the next she was burning. Her stillness broke into shivers so violent they seemed they might shake her apart. Whispers fell from her lips, nonsense words, names he didn't know. The ledger, the red folio, she muttered, her head thrashing side to side. Don't let him. Find it. Arthur dragged a chair close, a strange custodian to this delirium. He mopped her brow with a damp cloth, the simple human act feeling alien in his hands. He hadn't touched anyone with care in, he couldn't remember, years. As the night deepened, the fever talk sharpened. Alistair, she breathed, the name a sigh of pure dread. Lord Blackwood, her husband. You promised, a carriage home. Then, clearer, laced with a terror that cut through the haze. You left me. Arthur went very still. The words hung in the firelit air, more damning than any accusation. An accident was one thing. A carriage losing a wheel in a storm. But this was a different kind of cold. Her eyes flew open then, not with recognition, but with a glassy, fever-bright panic. She stared past him at the shadows dancing on the ceiling. He told the driver to go, she said, her voice a raw scrape. He looked right at me, and he told him to go. She fell back into a fitful sleep, but the truth of it had been laid bare in the space between them. Arthur sat back in his chair, the weight of her words settling over him. This wasn't a rescued victim. This was a fugitive, abandoned, left for dead by the very man who'd vowed to protect her. He looked at her, truly looked, not as Blackwood's prize, but as this woman, Eleanor. The delicate arch of her brows, the stubborn set of her jaw even in sleep. The wedding band looked less like a token now and more like a manacle. The storm outside was a prison, but it had saved her from a worse one. And it had delivered her, this ghost of his enemy's making, right into his crumbling sanctuary. The question wasn't why she was here anymore. It was what she was fleeing from, and what, exactly, she had meant about a ledger. The fever broke near dawn, leaving Eleanor weak as a newborn kitten, but lucid. The silence that followed was thick, awkward, charged with the unspoken truths of the night. Arthur brought her broth, a simple, salty thing he'd managed not to ruin. She took the bowl with hands that still trembled. Her eyes, a clear, intelligent gray now, watching him over the rim. "Thank you," she said, her voice hoarse. "Not for saving me, just thank you." It was a start. The storm, however, had no intention of being a mere backdrop. It intensified, sealing them in. Pendlewood became their entire world. The crackle of the fire, the sigh of the wind, the endless white beyond the windows. They were castaways on an island of stone and old books. And there was only one bed. Well, not precisely. There were a dozen cold, damp beds in the unused wings. But in the habitable part of the house, only 2 rooms held any warmth. The library, where she slept on the chaise, and Arthur's own bedchamber, connected by a dressing room. The first night after the fever, he'd gruffly offered her the bed. She'd refused, pride stiffening her spine, even as she swayed with exhaustion. They'd settled into a tense, ridiculous pattern. He slept in a chair by her chaise, neither of them resting properly. On the 3rd day of their confinement, the tension snapped. "This is absurd," Arthur finally growled, his own weariness making him blunt. "You'll take the bed. I'll not have you relapse and die of stupidity under my roof." She'd opened her mouth to argue, but a violent shiver racked her frame, betraying her. The library at night, even with the fire, was still bitterly cold. She looked at the dark doorway leading to his room, to a proper bed with curtains that could hold in heat. A war waged in her eyes, propriety against survival. "One room," she said softly, almost to herself. Then she met his gaze. "But you'll stay in it, on the settee, if there is one." He gave a short, sharp nod. "One room, one bed. For the warmth, nothing more." It was the most intimate arrangement imaginable, and yet, within those close quarters, something began to soften. The sheer practicality of it stripped away a layer of pretense. He saw her carefully folding her ruined wedding gown, a look of profound finality on her face. She saw the way he meticulously tended the fire, his movements economical, a man used to making do. They began to talk, not about the storm or Blackwood, but about inconsequential things. She asked about a book on his shelf, a volume on botany. He was surprised she could read the Latin. "I was an archivist," she said, a flicker of her old life in her eyes. "Before." The word hung there, heavy with everything it meant. One evening, as they shared a simple meal of bread and cheese by the hearth, she told him of the abandonment without the fever's haze. Calmly, precisely. He had the driver turn back after the wheel struck the rock. He said he would send help from the next posting house. He looked at me. Arthur. He knew the storm. He knew. She didn't cry. The horror was in the flatness of her tone. Arthur found himself not just listening, but hearing. The anger he'd carried for years, a cold stone in his gut, began to heat. But it wasn't for his own lost fortunes anymore. It was for the woman sitting across from him, methodically tearing a piece of bread apart, her gaze fixed on the flames. The enemy's line had been redrawn. It no longer lay between 2 estates. It lay between Eleanor and the man who had cast her out into the snow. And Arthur, to his own shock, found himself standing firmly on her side of it. The revelation didn't come in a dramatic shout. It came quietly, over the mending of a shirt. Eleanor had insisted on earning her keep, her archivist's fingers surprisingly deft with a needle. Arthur sat across from her, pretending to read, but his attention was caught by the focused line of her brow, the way she bit her lip in concentration. The domesticity of it was a strange, sweet ache. "He didn't marry me for a dowry," she said, her voice so low he almost missed it. She didn't look up from her stitching. "I haven't a penny to my name. He married me for silence." Arthur lowered his book. The fire popped. "Before the wedding, I was cataloging the Blackwood family papers, the old Earl's collection. A mess of boxes no one had touched in decades." Her needle paused. "I found a red folio, tied with a black ribbon. Inside were the original settlement documents for the Pendlewood mining rights." The air left Arthur's lungs. The Pendlewood rights, the source of the wealth that had built his family's fortune, and that Blackwood's father had swindled from his own, a theft that had started the long slide into ruin. The law had sided with the Blackwoods on a technicality, on forged papers. Arthur's father had died of the shame. It was the bedrock of Arthur's hatred. The signatures were witnessed differently than in the version presented to the courts, Eleanor continued, her eyes now fixed on the middle distance, seeing the past. The dates were off by a week. There was a marginal note from a solicitor questioning the transfer. It was clearly the true document, the one that proved the rights were never Blackwood's to sell. They were yours. A roaring started in Arthur's ears, louder than the storm. All these years. The proof had existed, buried in his enemy's own house. "Alistair found me with it," she whispered. "I was too shocked to hide it. He was charming at first, said it was a fascinating historical discrepancy. Then he proposed. It was so sudden, so grand. A viscountess, a way out of the dusty archives. I was a fool." She finally looked at him, her gaze clear and full of a terrible remorse. "The marriage was the legal bind. As my husband, any document in my possession became his. My testimony, should I ever give it, would be seen as a wife's hysterical fancy, or worse, influenced by another man." Arthur understood with a cold, clarifying fury. The marriage, the swift departure for a honeymoon that conveniently traversed the moors in the worst storm in a generation. The abandoned carriage. It wasn't just cruelty. It was a final, neat solution. Silence the witness, destroy the evidence, all in one tragic accident. "The folio," he managed to say, his voice rough. "Where is it?" Eleanor set the mending aside. She stood, moved to the heap of her discarded wedding clothes. From a hidden pocket, sewn into the lining of the fur cloak, a pocket meant for a lady's smelling salts, or a handkerchief, she drew out a folded packet of heavy parchment. She carried it back to him as if it were a holy relic, or a live coal. She placed it in his hands. "I took it the morning we left. I knew what he might do. When the carriage crashed, and he gave the order to leave, I didn't try to go to the posting house." She took a deep, shuddering breath. "I ran the other way, into the storm, toward Pendlewood. I had to get it to you. Even if I froze solid on your doorstep, I had to get it to you." Arthur stared at the packet, then at her. This woman, who he'd pitied as a pawn, was no pawn. She had walked into a blizzard to bring him his future. She had chosen his ruin over her own safety. The weight in his hands wasn't just paper. It was his name, his legacy, his vengeance, all delivered by the one person his enemy had tried to erase. And it was also her death warrant, if Blackwood ever discovered she'd lived, and that the proof had survived. Arthur held not just his salvation, but the weapon that could get her killed. The storm broke on the morning of the 5th day. not with a whimper, but with a sudden, eerie silence that was more shocking than the wind's scream. Sunlight, weak and pale, pierced the clouds, glinting off a world sculpted in blinding white. The prison of Pendlewood now had its gates thrown open. And with the silence came the sound they'd both been dreading. The distant jingle of harnesses, the crunch of wheels on compacted snow. A carriage was coming up the long, buried drive. Eleanor's face went as white as the landscape outside. She stood by the library window, her hand pressed to the cold glass. Arthur stood beside her, the red folio a searing brand against his chest, where he tucked it inside his waistcoat. The proof, the vengeance, his for the taking. He could see it all play out with a barrister's cold clarity. Present the documents. Have Eleanor testify to their provenance and her husband's abandonment. Blackwood would be ruined, socially, financially, utterly. The title might not be stripped, but the wealth and respectability would be. Arthur would reclaim what was his. He would win. He looked at Eleanor's profile, the tight line of her jaw, the fear she was trying so hard to master. To do that, he would have to put her on a witness stand. He would have to hand her back, legally, to the man who left her to die, while the entire world watched and dissected her character. She would be called a liar, an adulteress, a hysteric. Even if they won, she would be destroyed. Blackwood would see to it. The carriage, a sleek black monstrosity bearing the now hated crest, pulled to a halt in the courtyard. The door opened. Lord Alistair Blackwood emerged, wrapped in furs that made him look like a prosperous bear. His face was a mask of concerned nobility, but his eyes, as they scanned the front of the hall, were sharp and cold as the ice on the eaves. Arthur made his choice. He took Eleanor's hand from the windowpane. It was ice cold. He turned her to face him. "Do you trust me?" he asked, his voice low and urgent. Her gray eyes searched his, wide with fear, but beneath it, he saw a flicker of the steel that had made her run into a blizzard. Slowly, she nodded. "Then follow my lead, and say nothing." He led her from the library, not to the front door, but to the grand, dusty staircase in the main hall. He positioned them at the top of the stairs, a tableau of defiance, just as the front door was thrown open without ceremony. Blackwood stood in the entrance, blinking in the dim light. His gaze swept over the decay, a smirk touching his lips before it landed on them, on Eleanor, alive and well, standing beside Arthur. The smirk vanished. "Eleanor, my dear, thank God," Blackwood boomed, starting forward, his voice dripping with relief that didn't reach his eyes. "We've been searching for days. I've been out of my mind." Arthur didn't move. He simply stared down at the man, his arm a solid, unmovable barrier at Eleanor's back. "She's not going with you, Blackwood." The Lord stopped, his face hardening. "You have no right, Pendleton. She is my wife." "Is she?" Arthur's voice was calm, deadly. "The woman you abandoned in a wrecked carriage during a killing storm? The woman you left to freeze? I found her nearly dead. By every law of God and man, your claim on her ended the moment you drove away." He felt Eleanor tremble beside him, but she held her ground. Blackwood's mask slipped entirely, revealing the viciousness beneath. "You have no proof of that. It's your word against mine. And she," he pointed a gloved finger, "is mine by law. You are harboring my property. I'll have the magistrates here by noon." Arthur smiled then, a thin, cold thing. He reached into his waistcoat. Blackwood's eyes followed the movement, a flicker of unease in them. But Arthur didn't pull out the folio. He pulled out a single, folded sheet, a copy of the marriage registry he'd had his solitary, loyal old solicitor draw up years ago for a different, bitter purpose. He let it flutter down the stairs. "You're welcome to fetch the magistrates," Arthur said, his voice ringing in the silent hall. "But you'll be explaining to them why you're harassing my wife, the Viscountess Pendleton. Our marriage by special license was solemnized yesterday by the Vicar of High Moor, who braved the snow at my request. A witness to your abandonment was most persuasive. It was a bluff, a glorious, dangerous bluff. There was no vicar, no license, not yet. But the claim, made publicly, would create a scandal so immense, so tangled, that Blackwood would be mired in it for years. And the real document, the red folio, was Arthur's insurance. If Blackwood pressed the issue, Arthur would use it to crush him completely." Blackwood stared, his face purpling with rage and disbelief. He looked from Arthur's unyielding face to Eleanor's, seeing not fear now, but a quiet, settled resolve. He saw that he had lost, not just the pawn, but the game. To fight for her now would be to invite the scrutiny he desperately needed to avoid. With a sound of pure fury, he turned on his heel and stormed back to his carriage. The door slammed. The wheels crunched on the snow, retreating. The silence that filled the hall was different this time. It was warm. It was theirs. Arthur let out a long, shaky breath. He looked down at Eleanor. The rising sun through the dusty window caught the tears on her cheeks, but she was smiling, a real, true smile that lit her whole face. "The Vicar of High Moor is quite resilient," she whispered, at her voice trembling with relief and something else, something bright and new. "He is," Arthur agreed, his own heart pounding a wild, hopeful rhythm. He brought her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles, right over the simple gold band she still wore, a band that would soon be replaced. "And he makes house calls for a very reasonable fee." Outside, the sun climbed higher, melting the ice from the windows, flooding the crumbling great hall of Pendlewood with a light it hadn't seen in years. It was the dawn of a new season. And for the first time in a very, very long time, Arthur Pendleton felt the deep, thawing warmth of something he thought he'd lost forever, a future.